You can't even imagine what the ancient Egyptians ate. The daily diet of the creators of one of the greatest civilizations was simpler and sometimes harsher than you might think. At the same time, their culinary knowledge and food storage techniques are still impressive even today. Forget the lavish feasts of Hollywood movies. We will immerse ourselves in the world of authentic Egyptian cuisine, from the modest lunch of a pyramid builder to the exquisite dishes on the Pharaoh's table. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how ordinary onions became currency and why the most popular beer was more like a nutritious porridge. The staple of every Egyptian's diet, from the simple peasant to the almighty Pharaoh, was bread. It was not just a food product, but a universal unit of measurement and even a form of wages. The value of labor, goods and services was often expressed in terms of the number of loaves of bread. The main cereals used for bread production were emmer, a type of spelt, and barley. Wheat, as we know it today, was virtually unknown to the Egyptians. Emmer produced a dense and nutritious flour, which was the basis for dozens of types of bread. The process of obtaining flour was incredibly laborious. Women spent hours grinding grain on stone grinders while kneeling. This hard work led to occupational joint diseases, as confirmed by studies of mummies. The quality of the flour left much to be desired. Along with the grain, small particles of stone from the millstones, sand, and other impurities got into the flour. Because of this, the bread was very abrasive and led to rapid tooth wear among the entire population of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians knew both unleavened and leavened bread. They were among the first to master the technology of baking with yeast, which allowed them to obtain more fluffy and soft products. Yeast was taken from the remains of beer wort. Baking molds were varied and often had symbolic meaning. Bread was made in the shape of ovals, triangles, cones, and even figures of people and animals. There were more than 40 different hieroglyphs to denote different types of bread. Bread was baked in conical clay ovens. First, the oven was heated to a high temperature, then the coals were raked out, and the dough pieces were attached directly to the hot inner walls. After a while, the finished bread peeled off and fell to the bottom of the oven. Various ingredients were added to the bread to give it flavor. Honey, dates, figs, flax seeds, or herbs could be mixed into the dough. Such bread was considered festive and was not available to everyone. Thank you for watching. Where are you watching us from? What interested you most about the process of making Egyptian bread? Bread was not only food, but also an important part of religious rituals. It was offered as a sacrifice to the gods and left in tombs as food for the deceased in the afterlife. It was believed that without bread, the soul would not be able to make its journey into eternity. The second pillar of the Egyptian diet, inextricably linked to bread, was beer. It was so important that it was called heneke and was considered a gift from the gods. Everyone from young to old drank beer, and it was an integral part of the daily diet. Egyptian beer was very different from the modern drink. It was thick, cloudy, and very nutritious, more like liquid porridge or soup. It was not so much drunk to quench thirst as eaten for sustenance. The production technology was closely related to bread baking. First, special beer breads were baked from barley or spelt flour, which were not brought to full readiness. These breads were then crumbled, poured with water, and left to ferment in large clay vessels. Fermentation occurred naturally due to wild yeast present in the air and on the surface of the grains. The process was uncontrolled, so the taste and strength of the beer could vary greatly from batch to batch. The finished product was not filtered, so it had to be drunk through special straws to remove the sediment and grain residues. There were many varieties of beer, which differed in color, density, and taste. There was sweet beer, thick beer, sacrificial beer, and even iron beer, whose name probably referred to its dark color. Some varieties were flavored with honey, dates, or herbs. Beer, like bread, was used as payment for labor. Pyramid builders and workers in royal necropolises received a daily ration that included several liters of beer. It was believed to give strength and help withstand heavy physical exertion. The drink played a central role in religious and festive ceremonies. It was consumed in abundance during festivals in honor of the goddess Hathor, who was considered the patroness of merriment and intoxication. It was believed that intoxication brought a person closer to the gods. Beer was also widely used in medicine. It served as the basis for the preparation of many medicines, to which herbs, minerals, and other healing ingredients were added. Beer itself was believed to have healing properties. Archaeologists have found evidence of brewing throughout Egypt, from small home breweries to large-scale production capable of supplying entire cities. The remains of a huge brewery were discovered in the ruins of a pyramid builder's settlement in Giza. Beer was not just a drink, but a symbol of Egyptian civilization. It provided calories, served as currency, medicine, and a means of communicating with the gods. Without beer, the history of ancient Egypt would have been completely different. Bread and beer were the food of the masses, but the Nile offered other riches, the extraction of which was often fraught with risk. In the next chapter, you will learn what dangers lurked in the reeds for those who tried to diversify their diet. Although the Nile was teeming with fish, attitudes toward it in ancient Egypt were extremely ambiguous. For the common people, fish was an important and accessible source of protein. It was caught, dried, salted, and eaten almost daily. However, priests and nobles often considered fish to be ritually unclean food. This was due to the myth of Osiris, whose body parts, according to legend, were eaten by fish. Therefore, during certain periods or within certain cults, the consumption of fish was strictly prohibited. Some species of fish were considered sacred and associated with certain deities. For example, the Nile perch, lates, was revered in the city of Letopolis, and killing it was considered sacrilege. Such fish were objects of worship, not food. The attitude towards vegetables, especially onions and garlic, was completely different. These plants were not just eaten, they were revered. Onions were valued for their antiseptic properties and were considered a symbol of eternal life because of their multi-layered structure. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote that a huge amount of silver was spent on the construction of the Pyramid of Cheops to buy onions, garlic, and radishes for the workers. This indicates that these vegetables were the basis of the diet and were valued as a means of maintaining health and working capacity. Oaths made on an onion were considered unbreakable. Onions also played an important role in funeral rituals. Their images are found on the walls of tombs, and real onions were placed next to mummies to ensure the deceased's well-being in the afterlife. Another important vegetable was lettuce. It was associated with the god of fertility, Min, and was considered a powerful aphrodisiac. The Egyptians grew a variety of lettuce that grew vertically upward, further enhancing its symbolic connection to fertility. Some foods were strictly forbidden for certain social groups. For example, pork was considered unclean food associated with the god Set, the murderer of Osiris. Commoners were allowed to eat pork, but priests and pharaohs were strictly forbidden to do so. Legumes, such as beans, also had a controversial status. On the one hand, they were a nutritious and affordable food. On the other hand, priests were forbidden to eat them or even touch them, as they were believed to cause impure thoughts. Thus, food choices in ancient Egypt were determined not only by taste and availability, but also by a complex system of religious beliefs and social prohibitions. What was everyday food for one person could be a mortal sin for another. For the vast majority of Egyptians, the Nile was the main source of animal protein. The river and its marshy delta provided an enormous amount of fish. The main species caught were tilapia, catfish, mullet, and Nile perch. There were various methods of fishing. Woven nets were cast from boats or from the shore. Fishing rods with bone or copper hooks and spears were also used to hunt large fish in shallow water. Fishing scenes are one of the most popular subjects in tomb paintings. They depict Egyptians sailing through papyrus thickets in light boats and eagerly pulling in a rich catch. This shows how important this industry was in their daily lives. The fish they caught was cooked in different ways. They grilled it over an open fire, boiled it, but most often they preserved it for later. To do this, they gutted the fish, salted it, and hung it out to dry in the sun, which allowed them to store it for months. The marshy banks of the Nile were also a paradise for waterfowl. The Egyptians hunted ducks, geese, quails, and pelicans. Bird hunting was not only a trade, but also a popular pastime for the nobility. The main weapon for hunting birds was a throwing stick, a curved piece of wood similar to a boomerang. The hunter would sneak up on a flock of birds in the papyrus thickets and, with a well-aimed throw, knock down several flying birds at once. Large nets were also used, which were stretched between poles and snapped shut when the birds landed on the bait. The captured birds were plucked and cooked on a spit over coals. Roast goose or duck was considered a delicacy and was often served at feasts for the nobility. For long-term storage, birds were also salted and dried. Wild bird eggs were another important addition to the diet. The Egyptians collected eggs from nests and ate them, as well as the eggs of domestic chickens, which they began to breed at a later period. But what about meat from larger animals? In the next chapter, you will learn how often it appeared on the Egyptian table. Meat from domestic animals was a sign of wealth and high status. For most Egyptians, it was a rare delicacy that appeared on the table only on major holidays or during sacrifices. Everyday consumption of meat was a privilege of the nobility and the pharaoh. The main source of meat was cattle. Bulls and cows were valued not only for their meat, but also as a source of draft power and milk. The slaughter of a bull was an event in itself, often timed to coincide with religious festivals. After the ritual slaughter, the carcass was carefully cut up. The best cuts, such as the tenderloin and hindquarters, were reserved for sacrifices to the gods and for the tables of the nobility. The remaining parts were distributed among the participants in the ceremony. In addition to cattle, the Egyptians raised sheep and goats. These animals were less finicky and provided not only meat but also wool and milk. Lamb and goat meat were more affordable than beef. Meat was prepared in various ways. It was roasted on spits, stewed with vegetables in clay pots, and boiled. For long-term storage, the meat was cut into thin strips, salted, and dried in the sun, producing an analog of modern basturma. Hunting wild animals was another source of meat, but this was an entertainment exclusively for the pharaoh and his entourage. Gazelles, antelopes, and wild bulls were hunted in the desert. A successful hunt demonstrated the power and valor of the ruler. Mummified pieces of meat, packed in special vessels, are often found in tombs. These were offerings intended to provide the deceased with food in the afterlife. Analysis of these samples provides scientists with valuable information about the preservation methods and types of meat consumed by the Egyptians. Thus, a meat-based diet in ancient Egypt was a clear social marker. While a peasant could afford meat only a few times a year, it was a regular feature on the table of a nobleman, emphasizing his high position in society. Along with grains, vegetables formed the basis of the Egyptians' daily diet. Thanks to the fertile soil of the Nile Valley, they grew a wide variety of garden crops. Vegetables provided the body with essential vitamins and minerals. The main vegetables on the Egyptian table were onions, garlic, and leeks. They were eaten in huge quantities, both raw and cooked. They were considered not only nutritious, but also healing, protecting against disease. Root vegetables such as radishes and turnips were equally popular. They were eaten as a separate dish or added to soups and stews. They stored well and were available throughout the year. The Egyptians also grew various types of lettuce and leafy greens. Lettuce, which has already been mentioned, was especially prized. Its leaves were an important source of fresh greens in the diet. Cucumbers and melons were a favorite treat in hot weather. Their juicy flesh was perfect for quenching thirst. Images of these fruits are often found on reliefs and in paintings. Legumes played a vital role in the diet. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans were the main source of vegetable protein for the population. They were used to make thick soups and purees, which were eaten with bread. Vegetable oils were widely used in cooking. The most common was oil from flax seeds. Oil was also produced from radish and sesame seeds, which appeared in Egypt at a later period. Olive oil was known but considered a luxury. Olive trees did not grow well in the Egyptian climate, so the oil was mainly imported from the Levant and Greece. It was used by the nobility and in religious rituals. Vegetables and greens not only provided variety in the diet, but were also available to all segments of the population. Every home had a vegetable garden, from the modest hut of a peasant to the luxurious villa of a nobleman. And what did the Egyptians have for dessert? In the next chapter, we will talk about the sweet gifts of the Egyptian land. The main source of sweetness for the ancient Egyptians was fruit. Sugar cane was unknown to them, so all desserts and sweet dishes were based on natural products. Fruit gardens were a source of pride and a symbol of wealth. Dates occupied a central place among fruits. The date palm was one of the most revered trees, providing not only fruit, but also wood and material for weaving. Dates were eaten fresh, dried, and used to make sweet pastes and fillings. Figs, or sycamore, were no less important. The fruits of this tree were very sweet and nutritious. Figs, like dates, were eaten fresh and dried and were often used in baking. Grapes were grown mainly in the Nile Delta and oases. They were eaten fresh, dried to make raisins, and of course used to make wine. Wine, unlike beer, was a drink of the elite and was used in temple rituals. The Egyptians also knew and loved pomegranates. These juicy fruits with bright seeds were considered a symbol of fertility. Their juice was drunk, and the seeds were added to various dishes to give them a sweet and sour taste. Watermelons and melons grown in gardens were a popular treat. Not only did they delight with their sweet taste, but they also helped to endure the heat. Their images are often found on funeral offerings. The main sweetener available to the Egyptians was honey. Beekeeping was well developed, and bees were kept in special clay hives. Honey was a very expensive product, a real luxury available only to the wealthiest. Another delicacy was the fruit of the carob tree. Its sweet pods were chewed and syrup was made from the pulp. This product was a more affordable alternative to expensive honey. The kitchen utensils of the ancient Egyptians were simple but functional. They cooked mainly in clay pots, bowls, and jugs. Flat clay or stone pans were used for frying. The cooking area was usually located in the courtyard of the house so that smoke and heat did not penetrate the living quarters. It was a simple pit in the ground lined with stones or a small clay oven. The homes of the nobility had separate kitchens with more sophisticated ovens. Stone mortars and pestles were used to grind food. Knives, ladles, and spoons were made of wood, bone, or metal. All tableware was utilitarian and designed for long-term use. Since refrigerators did not exist, food preservation was a vital task. The Egyptians developed effective preservation methods that allowed them to build up reserves in case of crop failure. The most common method was sun-drying. Fish, meat, vegetables, and fruit were cut up and laid out on mats under the scorching sun. Egypt's hot and dry climate was ideal for this. Dried foods could be stored for months without losing their nutritional value. Another important method of preservation was salting. Salt was extracted in desert oases or obtained by evaporating seawater. Meat and fish were salted in large clay vessels, which also ensured long-term storage. Grain, as the main strategic product, was stored in special granaries. These were tall structures made of unfired bricks with hatches at the top for loading grain and latches at the bottom for dispensing it. Such storage facilities protected the harvest from moisture, rodents, and thieves. The difference in diet between the different strata of Egyptian society was enormous. The diet of a simple peasant or worker was monotonous and consisted of the most basic foods. It was designed to maintain strength for hard physical labor. A typical daily diet for a peasant included several large flatbreads made from barley or spelt flour. These were served with a bunch of onions or garlic and a bowl of thick lentil soup. The main drink was beer, which provided additional calories. Fish caught in the Nile was the main source of protein. Meat was rarely served, mainly during religious holidays when temples distributed sacrificial meat among the population. The picture was completely different at the feasts of the pharaoh and the nobility. The tables were laden with an abundance and variety of dishes. Such feasts were not just a meal, but a demonstration of the host's power, wealth, and generosity. Several types of meat were served at the feast: roast beef, lamb, and goat. Game was an essential part of a rich table: roast geese, ducks, and quails. Meat was served with various sauces based on honey, vinegar, and herbs. Vegetables and fruits were served in the form of complex compositions. Salads, pickled vegetables, fresh dates, figs, grapes, and pomegranates were served. The tables were decorated with lotus flowers. Bread for the nobility was baked from finely ground flour and had exquisite shapes. It was served with various types of cheese made from cows' or goats' milk. Several varieties of wine from the best wineries were offered as drinks. Desserts consisted of sweet pastries with honey and nuts, honey cakes, and fresh fruit. The feast was accompanied by music, dancing, and acrobatic performances. It was a real theatrical performance. Food at feast was eaten with the hands, so servants constantly brought guests vessels of water to wash their hands. After a hearty meal, guests were offered incense to scent their clothes and wigs. The contrast between the modest peasant's lunch and the nobleman's lavish feast clearly reflected the social structure of ancient Egypt. Food was not just a means of survival, but also an important indicator of status and position in society. The Egyptians' attitude toward food was inextricably linked to their beliefs about the afterlife. They believed that after death, the human soul, ki, continued to need food and drink. Therefore, providing the deceased with provisions for eternity was one of the main tasks of the funeral ritual. The tombs of pharaohs and nobles were literally filled with food supplies. Archaeologists find jugs of wine and beer, baskets of bread and fruit, and vessels of honey and oil there. All this was supposed to serve as food for the deceased in the other world. Special attention was paid to meat and poultry. Whole carcasses of oxen, geese, and ducks were mummified, wrapped in linen cloth, and placed in special boxes. These meat mummies were supposed to provide an eternal supply of protein. However, over time, the Egyptians realized that real food spoils over time. Therefore, scenes of food production and offering began to be depicted on the walls of tombs. It was believed that the magical power of images would turn them into real food for the soul. On the walls, we see entire cycles. Here, peasants are plowing the fields, sowing grain, and harvesting crops. Nearby, bakers are kneading dough and baking bread, while brewers are preparing beer. These images were a kind of eternal cookbook for the deceased. In addition to drawings, detailed lists of sacrifices were left in the tombs. They listed hundreds of food items that were to magically appear daily on the deceased's sacrificial table. 1,000 loaves of bread, 1,000 jugs of beer, 1,000 oxen. These are the standard formulas. For those who could not afford rich paintings, miniature models were made of wood or clay. These could be figures of servants grinding grain, baking bread, or entire models of breweries and cattle yards. It was believed that in the afterlife, these models would come to life and work for their master. The most important element of the tomb was the false door, a stone stele depicting the deceased sitting at a table laden with food. According to Egyptian beliefs, it was through this door that the soul left the burial chamber to receive offerings. The relatives of the deceased were supposed to visit the tomb regularly and bring real food and drink. However, over time, this duty was transferred to special priests and then became symbolic, giving way to magical images and texts. Thus, food for the Egyptians was a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It was a guarantee not only of earthly existence, but also of eternal life in the fields of Yaru, the Egyptian paradise, where, as they believed, eternal abundance and feasts awaited them. We conclude our journey into the world of ancient Egyptian cuisine. Today we learned that the diet of the creators of this great civilization was both simple and surprisingly complex. It was based on bread and beer, but was supplemented by the gifts of the Nile, vegetables from fertile fields, and rare delicacies from the tables of the nobility. Food was not just a means of satisfying hunger, it was currency, medicine, a social marker, and the key to eternal life. Through the prism of cuisine, we see a complex system of beliefs, social relations, and inventive technologies that allowed this civilization to flourish for millennia. By studying what the Egyptians ate, we can better understand how they lived, worked, loved, and believed. Their attitude toward food is a lesson in how the most basic human needs can become the foundation for a great culture. What aspect of the Egyptian diet did you find most surprising or unexpected? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the past.